Hello and welcome to the Last Word on Spurs. We do hope you're keeping very, very safe and well. Thank you ever so much for joining us as we are here on the opening of the summer transfer window, like we'd be anywhere else on this Last Word on Spurs. Here to bring to you, of course, reaction across the summer to all of Tottenham Hotspur's latest transfer news. And my God, what a guest we've got joining us, starting us off on what, as Lee McQueen always calls it, the crazy, crazy train. Before we get into the main man that's joined us tonight, we're delighted to have back alongside us. And look, you know what time it is when he's back on our screens. We've got the wonderful Jamie Brown over at the Daily Hotspur. Jay, these times were made for you, weren't they?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's obviously the time everything comes alive. The exciting bit for me, and I do enjoy a transfer, as everyone knows. And obviously got a fantastic guest on to talk about it tonight. So, really looking forward to it.
Absolutely. I say delighted to have this man back alongside us. He's been famed on Last Word on Spurs for the encyclopedic knowledge. Every time he comes on, I always have people messaging me and saying, bring this man back immediately. The problem is with Ben, naturally, we can only get him on during the transfer windows because the poor man is resting and then getting all that information ready to then absolutely unload on us when those windows come back around. So it's my pleasure to welcome back to Last Word on Spurs, the broadcaster, journalist from CBS Golazo. We've got the wonderful Ben Jacobs back on our screens. Ben, lovely to have you here. How are you?
Very well indeed. As you say, it's busy times, but an absolute pleasure to be back, Ricky and Jamie, and lots to delve into because I think Spurs will be busier than most.
We hope so, Ben. Already starting off a good fit with the Spurs fans. That's how we're going to be busy. Ben, you know what might be a really good place to start? We discussed this briefly off air. Naturally, as Spurs fans, some of us can be quite impatient. And at the time of recording the show a year ago, Spurs were closing in on Yves Bissouma, which would have been their second signing of the summer. This time around, I think it's fair to say things are a little bit quieter. Bearing in mind, they've only just got the manager over the line, of course, in these last week or so. So before we touch upon the new manager, just maybe give us an insight on what it is like covering the summer transfer window and how that kind of peaks and troughs throughout when it opens like today through to the end of it. And likewise, Jamie, as well, if you wish.
Well, it's day one of the transfer window in England and Scotland for men's clubs, and I already look dead, or at least half dead. So that tells you that it's tiring to cover and you have to cut through the smoke effectively and try and navigate the situation because you get a lot of competing narratives. And you only have to look at Tottenham, for example, and on the managerial front, the pursuit, if you like, in inverted commas, of Julian Nagelsmann. And there were two sides to that. Spurs arguing they didn't want him, Nagelsmann arguing that they didn't want Spurs. And you can go direct to sources and you can still get two completely different things. So it's challenging at times. And it's often about trying to be right, not first. And if you can be first and right, then it's a bonus. But I think when we look at the window and impatience, it's also important to point out that being first in terms of speed to transfers is not necessarily the primary concern of your football club. And I understand that fans, especially those like me that play Football Manager, feel like there's a list, attack the list, rank the list, put your money down, get the deal done, come into pre-season and have all of these names. But I think that Chelsea showed us in January over a short period of time, if you add too many players, it can also be a bit of a disaster in terms of chemistry. And the other thing is that if you're on holiday and you go into a gift shop and you see something nice and you spend all of your pocket money or holiday money on it, then you might walk around and 3 hours later see a better shop and not have any money left. So the reality of a transfer window is that clubs look at it in phases. There's the business you want to do because you're positive on it, you've pre-planned it. And this is often what a technical director at a football club will be a part of, not just a sporting director or a senior leadership team. You're window planning. And as a result, you understand the movement of the market and you get stuff done early. And I think that Liverpool are actually the best at that, which is why they've been able to bring in Alexis McAllister for only 35 million before the window has even officially opened. So that's one type of business. And this is what Spurs did quite well, even though in hindsight, not every player became integral and was in the starting 11. It looked like they did that quite well. Champions League football came, there was 100 million or so invested from Daniel Levy to allow the club to move and be ambitious. And they got their business done early and at high volume. And that's phase one of the window. Phase two is then pre-season. And maybe during pre-season, the manager says, I'm glad I waited because actually I've realized working with these new players or existing ones that we need X, not Y. Stage 3 is after you've played a few games, you start to think, let's assess, let's almost do a post-mortem on the window so far. Now there's only a month or so left. What do we need? And then you enter into the final weeks of the window where you're scrambling to get business done. And you might pivot on a target because you've missed out on a long-standing target, or somebody might become available, or you might pick up an injury and then realize you need to move in a different direction. So I think right now it's not about how fast Spurs can move. It's about a couple of priority positions, quite clearly defender and centre-back and goalkeeper. But as the window progresses and Ange Postecoglou understands Tottenham, he assesses what he's got, there'll be input, and a new sporting director as well, if one comes in the coming weeks, will be a big factor, as will Scott Munn as well, although it's important to note that Fabio Paratici was in this sort of all-in role, whereas now you've got Scott Munn plus sporting director and Ange Postecoglou. So there'll be a fair amount of new senior faces at Spurs inputting. So again, why would you rush before Postecoglou's had any time on the training field, before a new sporting director's come in, before Spurs have even kicked a ball next season? It's a long window. So it's really important to understand that success in a transfer window isn't only about getting your business done fast, it's about getting your business done at the right time as well.
Fascinating. Ben, thank you so much. Right, we are going to get straight into it here. Thank you so much for joining us as always here on Last Word on Spurs. If you are listening to us for the first time, you can find us on iTunes or on Spotify. We're of course on all major audio platforms. And of course, you're one of the people now currently watching us live on YouTube. Now, Ben, Spurs have found their man. They've appointed Ange Postecoglou on a 4-year deal. He becomes the first Australian to manage in the Premier League, and he will formally join Spurs on July the 1st after 2 years at Celtic, in which he won back-to-back Scottish Premier League titles and a domestic treble this season. Really keen to get your thoughts, if we can, Ben, on the overall appointment, and would be really keen to know how far he was up Spurs' managerial shortlist of targets.
Well, let's start with the second point. Targets and shortlists for managers are usually a bit of a myth. Of course, certain names will leap out, but ultimately it's not quite like transfer targets. It's a little bit more fluid, I would say. So it's obvious, for example, that above Ange Postecoglou in the process anyway was someone like Arne Slot. But there were issues there in terms of a clean negotiation at a financial level that Spurs were prepared to proceed in. And in the end, he signed a new deal. So became someone that wasn't possible. But with Ange Postecoglou, he was always there. And there were other names too, for example, like Vincent Kompany, where Spurs thought perhaps they were going in a young, up-and-coming direction. And again, he signs a new deal at Burnley. So sometimes you know the name you might want to at least consider, and they're just not feasible. Luis Enrique was up there as well, but is very stubborn in both a good and a bad way in terms of what he expects and asks for from a football club. And I think the feeling at Spurs, even before they advanced anything, was, is he going to be the right fit for this project? And I think also what changed the search was the Antonio Conte situation too, which is a very interesting and unfortunate one. But regardless of how he left and when he left, Tottenham knew that he was going at the end of the season, and only something astonishing would have changed that. Even Champions League football might not have changed that, because Antonio Conte was a little bit mentally checked out. He'd unfortunately had some personal issues as well. And it's important to understand that wider context. And maybe one day the entire story will come out. But as a consequence, Daniel Levy had been thinking with Fabio Paratici, let's not forget at the time, about who was on the short list. And then that shortlist became longer, but also different names because of circumstance, because Tottenham looking for a manager when they thought Conte was going, and they thought they had time at that point. And then after he went was very different post Paratici, because he was the one by Levy being asked to draw up the shortlist. So Luis Enrique, for example, was a little bit higher. So things pivoted. And I also think the fact that Spurs had to have 2 interims also changed things a little bit as well. And you could even argue Graham Potter had left Chelsea, and Tottenham really liked Potter when he was still at Brighton, but the experience at Chelsea put off Tottenham from seriously approaching Potter in any way, shape or form. And I think it was largely the same with Brendan Rodgers as well, who, by the way, I think would have been a really good fit for Tottenham. Not necessarily the most popular manager, but stylistically a decent fit. But again, he'd left Leicester struggling. They ended up going down. So he was never likely to be a leading candidate. But there were plenty of people within the Tottenham hierarchy that thought that he also might be someone that was right for the project, but not necessarily the fan base. And that had to be considered by Levy, because ultimately he was facing a sort of mini crisis, and the deep, unpopular feeling had almost migrated entirely onto Levy's shoulders, because who was left? Conte had gone, Paratici had gone, 2 interim managers. So eventually it's always going to come back to the owner. And I think that we've seen exactly the same thing at Chelsea as well, where it was all Graham Potter's fault. But by the end of the season, there were a lot more fingers being, whether rightly or wrongly, pointed at the ownership group. So then there's suddenly Ange Postecoglou. And I'm not saying when he was first linked that every single Tottenham fan had buy-in, but everything that Postecoglou has fits Tottenham's project. And Scott Munn is obviously familiar with Postecoglou. They crossed paths in the A-League, even though they were at different Melbourne clubs. And on top of that, the style, the attack-minded, slightly gung-ho nature of Postecoglou was of real appeal to Tottenham, because this is a football club that are not interested in grinding their way to improvement, maybe grinding their way to trophies if that happened. And that was sort of Jose Mourinho at times when he was at Chelsea, but not improving slowly where the style of football is not exciting to the fan base. So Postecoglou comes with success, having done incredibly well at Celtic, 5 trophies out of 6 won. He plays a 4-3-3. The wingers are usually very wide, and the main aim of the formation is to create space inside the inside channels for either the fullback or the central midfielders to really exploit. And what we see, therefore, is 2 key aspects which Postecoglou is going to have to really build at Spurs. One is ball-playing defenders, including centre-backs, so it becomes even more of a priority to find them. And the other is fullbacks. And with the fullbacks, it's not just a case of them bombing forwards and getting wide, because ahead of them in that 4-3-3, the 3 and the 3, the 2 that are on the wide sides of the midfield and the forwards go very wide anyway. So actually what Postecoglou likes is his fullbacks to cut in diagonally and then stretch players out of positions, which can either benefit them because they can dribble forwards and become goal-scoring fullbacks, or alternatively, they can create space and opportunities for those in central midfield, or of course, ultimately Harry Kane, who if he stays at the football club, will remain the focal point of the team. So when you watch Celtic, what you see is effectively, and I'm simplifying it, but in layman's terms, the football field is really big. And everyone has to move, and everyone has to be confident on the ball, and everyone has to be quick, and everybody has to be direct. And then off the ball, they need that stamina and fitness to get back into shape. So this is good news for Tottenham, because it's less, I would say, formulaic and defensive-minded than under Antonio Conte. But given in that defensive-minded setup, Tottenham still conceded tons of goals. The worry is under Postecoglou, they may be a little bit more exposed. So they have to get the defending right and be composed and find a way to cover each other when people are attacking and get out of position, and also track back to make sure that they've got the fitness and discipline to go back into a defensive shape. Otherwise, in learning this style, not that a 4-3-3 or this particular way of attacking is particularly new, but to transition from Conte ball to Postecoglou ball via 2 interims is quite a big leap on paper. And this is why pre-season is going to be so important, because it's all very well scoring more goals and entertaining coming forwards, but if Tottenham is still shipping more goals, then they simply won't improve and climb up the Premier League table.
Now, obviously, a name you mentioned just earlier was Scott Munn. Of course, he arrived earlier this summer as the club's new chief football officer. I mean, firstly, and again, you also mentioned, obviously, he's worked with Postecoglou before, obviously, fellow countryman. So how much of an impact did he have on the appointment of Postecoglou? And if that is the case, do you think that Daniel Levy might now take a kind of a step back from the footballing side and allow Scott Munn to kind of, really get on with work in terms of the football side?
Well, I think unless Daniel Levy and Joe Lewis sell and then would be gone, or minority investment that I know we're going to talk about a little bit later, Daniel Levy will be Daniel Levy for the club and the brand. But on the football side, he had stepped back, even under Antonio Conte. And people might not realise it, but the summer window that Spurs had 1 year ago was entirely Paratici and Conte. And Ivan Perisic is a great example of that. Under previous managers, I don't think Daniel Levy would have sanctioned that particular deal because of the player's age and profile. So this isn't a new thing, Levy stepping back from the football side. Then flash forwards to the plans post-Conte, even when he was still at the football club. And who was drawing up the shortlist? It was Paratici as well, not Daniel Levy. So Levy's almost been sucked back into the football side because he's had to mop up a crisis. Some would say of his own creation, but again, there's lots of mitigating factors at play here. And I think Tottenham fans have rightly, justifiably, I wouldn't want to put words into anyone's mouth, but I'm sure that's the general sentiment in the chat, ganged up on Levy now. We saw the black balloons with Levy out. I think it was in the Crystal Palace game. Maybe it was more than once during the course of the season. But generally, Levy's commitment to the football club can't be doubted, but some of the decision-making can. And it depends which way you look at it, because most Spurs fans I speak to, they're not happy with the summer business. They're happy with the summer spend. They're happy with the summer volume, but they don't feel that many of last summer's signings became anything other than squad players. And really what Conte was saying is you have to have the ambition to go out there and get a couple of flagship signings that are indisputably in our starting 11, because that's how you strengthen. And Tottenham don't need the depth so much as to have a more consistent and competitive starting 11 in the context of challenging for the big four. Of course, they're still a very good side. They're always going to be in likelihood in the top half of the table, but this is a Tottenham side that was supposed to last season back up Champions League with Champions League, because from a project point of view, not just a football point of view, and also from a financial perspective, that's what you have to do. Because unless Tottenham become Champions League season after season after season, you can't budget for that. And if you can't budget for that, you can't improve as both a project and a brand. So I think that Daniel Levy would love to step away from the football side, and it will be easier for him in many ways to do so now, because crucially, Fabio Paratici had a slightly strange role in English football. It's far more common in other parts of Europe, but he was the sporting director and in essence, the general manager at the football club as well. So when you're an all-in-one kind of role, but actually doing two people's jobs at senior level, then Levy would still have to, I wouldn't say ease the burden on Paratici, but hold him accountable. Now you have a scenario where the new sporting director won't report directly to Levy, he'll report to Scott Munn. So you have somebody coming in to lead the football recruitment whilst Munn does the bigger picture on the football side. And that might be future window planning in conjunction with the sporting director, but it could also be things like facilities or academy pathways or the growth of the women's team in conjunction with their sporting side. So there's lots of different aspects of this, but it's effectively an extra person still doing the same combined roles that Paratici was doing, but two people splitting the responsibilities. So Levy can feel like suddenly they can have the chemistry, they can have the relationship, they can have three-way conversations, including Ange Postecoglou, and he might be able to step back from that. So I think that we'll see Daniel Levy come forwards when it really matters, which is typical of Levy. When Harry Kane's situation needs to be resolved one way or the other, of course Levy will be involved. If, and let's hope there isn't again, another need for a managerial change or someone at senior leadership level, Levy will have to lead on it, because he's become the kind of figure now that might want to step back from the football side. But if he has to get his hands dirty to fix a crisis, he's got no other choice. And this is where, and I'm bracing myself because I know Spurs fans will disagree, I feel a little bit sorry for him, because as much as many of the issues for Spurs can be pinned on him, he wouldn't have planned this season for Conte to go mid-season in an explosive press conference, and Paratici to be banned from football for 2.5 years, 2 interim managers and no European football. And again, I preface this by saying to all the Spurs fans listening, Levy has to take a large part of the blame, but he still has to mop up a crisis that was not entirely his doing or entirely on his time scale. And there's been so many pivots on the Spurs side from, like I said before, Paratici supposed to be leading recruitment, Paratici being banned, Conte likely going at the end of the season, to Conte going before the end of the season, and very publicly and in the end quite explosively, 2 interim managers. Harry Kane not signing a new deal when in October Spurs were actually quite calm and confident about that, and then no Champions League football. So I think because Levy is attached to the club, like Levy or loathe Levy, I don't think anyone can deny he's attached to the club. It's his innate instinct to try and get involved to fix things, because he obviously doesn't want the club to be where it is. And that's the bit I've got sympathy for, because there's some owners you look at and you think they don't care. Levy cares, and he cares more so because Joe Lewis is so distant that he effectively is the de facto owner, even though, of course, Joe Lewis is the big guy above him or in conjunction with him. So I think that he will step back. He wants to step back, but when he needs to get involved, it's just innate within how he operates and his personality to try and fix things that need fixing.
In these opening 20 minutes, Ben, you've spoken, touched upon briefly the need for a director of football. I know many are asking that question, really, where are we in the midst of that search? We've seen a whole host of names being mentioned for the job. Thiago Pinto, Marco Neppi, Monchi, of course, who we know now subsequently is at Aston Villa, Marcus Kroos, Tim Steidten, who now has joined West Ham United, and then there's been Phil Giles, Lee Dykes, Johannes Spors. Do we know, Ben, from your perspective, how that search is going, and when do you think the time frame will be in which Spurs will look to appoint that director of football so that individual and, of course, Ange Postecoglou can communicate so Spurs can start their summer transfer window in terms of bringing those players in?
I think the timescale is the most important. And before we delve into that, it's worth pointing out briefly that Tottenham's original plan was sporting director than manager. But of course, they've had to pivot the other way around due to circumstance. So that's another twist that Levy wasn't planning for. And if everything went how Levy thought, it would have been a case of bringing in a sporting director and then Antonio Conte going at the end of the season and then Spurs appointing a manager. Now they've had to do it the other way around. So, of course, suddenly Ange Postecoglou will have a lot more input. And that's significant because you can use that as a lure, of course, to appoint the manager first and say you're going to have some say over the interview process. So I still expect it to move relatively quickly in terms of timescale as far as Spurs are concerned. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out why, because the transfer window is now open and Tottenham do not have a sporting director. So they won't want to wait. But there's challenges here because they also cannot rush or make the wrong decision on this. It's just as important, if not more important even, than Ange Postecoglou, even though he'll take all of the limelight. And before we go into the names, worth mentioning that a sporting director in situ may not even be able to work during the summer window. It will all depend on the negotiation and any clauses, because it's very normal when somebody departs that they get put on gardening leave, because if they're in a job at the moment, especially if they're at a big club, then they will have been working for their club. So then by moving to Tottenham and working in this window, they will have insight and information that that club that they leave don't want. So it's going to be very interesting, for example, with Monchi and Aston Villa, and we have to now wait and see what the terms are. But for example, with Dan Ashworth, when he left Brighton, there was a long period before he was allowed to actually officially start at Newcastle United. With Lawrence Stewart, the co-sporting director at Chelsea, he was at Monaco and he couldn't start until after the January window, even though he joined before it. So there are some complications with certain candidates. One of the names that has been linked is Dimitri de Condé, who is relatively well thought after and is currently at the Belgium side Genk. Peter Kroonen, who is their chairman, doesn't think that he's going anywhere. So we have to wait and see whether that develops in any way. There is a growing feeling that Tottenham might look within the Premier League, which is why the links with Lee Dykes, for example, have materialised. Dykes has done many interviews saying that he's fully invested in the Brentford project. But again, you always expect somebody in that type of position to say precisely that. But quite clearly, this is the type of club, Brentford, Brighton, that we know historically at many different levels for senior leadership, whether it's in data or recruitment, Tottenham have looked at. So that could be one to watch as well. I don't think that they have focused on only one candidate, which is interesting because we hear two completely separate things. One is that Tottenham want to get this done quick, within 2 or 3 weeks. The other is that there's 3 or 4 candidates they're considering. So they're going to have to make up their mind relatively quickly as far as the sporting director is concerned. As you say, Monchi won't be a possibility. I'm not sure that he was ever really the right fit for a club like Tottenham. And another name we can rule out, former Tottenham, of course, is Paul Mitchell, who some Spurs fans might like to see come back. But Mitchell has no interest in returning to Spurs, but he's very keen on a Premier League move. And Chelsea have also been linked, but again, there's no substance to that either. In fact, if he was to return to the Premier League, I think it will be relatively contingent on whether one of the two groups being touted for Manchester United end up taking over there, particularly Sir Jim Ratcliffe, because Ineos really like Paul Mitchell and they've looked at him in the past in a group capacity because they have Nice as well as part of their Ineos portfolio. And Mitchell, obviously at Monaco, has got great familiarity with that particular league. So that might be one to watch, but for Manchester United, not Spurs. But at this stage, nothing too much more concrete to add. Some of the names that you've mentioned, like Thiago Pinto, have definitely been explored as well. But Tottenham are keeping their cards quite close to their chest at the moment on this one. And the last thing to say is, as you rightly pointed out, it looks like Tim Steidten is going to be going elsewhere to West Ham United. I think today we saw a lot of headlines, including from the excellent Fabrizio Romano, implying that that one is either done or pretty much done. From Enquiries today, I would largely echo that. I would say it's not 100% done yet, but it's moving in that direction. So do Spurs have any opportunity to react still? Legally, yes, because nothing is signed yet, but it's moving very quickly and it is looking like West Ham rather than Spurs as far as he's concerned.
So obviously in this window, we've seen a number of names linked already, a number of different positions. Now, obviously central defence, I think goalkeeper as well, and an attacking midfielder, all positions that have been linked. Do we know kind of where Ange Postecoglou is most hoping to strengthen this window? Do we know the specific positions we should be looking out for?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because there's no sporting director and because Paratici is banned, the manager will have a lot more control than normal. So traditionally, much like Pochettino coming in at Chelsea, you'd say, does it really matter what the manager wants? Well, yes, because he inputs, but no, because a proper planning club should have a plan in place. And if they only appointed the manager formally a few days ago, then early business, remember at the beginning of the show, we spoke about the different phases of the window, early business should be part of the pre-Postecoglou plan. And he'll have inputs, but Tottenham should be advanced on certain deals. So I think if we're talking about positions pre-Postecoglou, it has to be centre-back because Spurs were just gifting sides leads all season and shipping goals for fun. And it has to be goalkeeper because they need a succession plan for Hugo Lloris, who's been a fantastic servant for the club, but it's obvious that Spurs need to look for a new long-term number one. And this is why they're progressing with David Raya. So Raya is a good example. That's not Postecoglou coming in and saying, can we move for Raya, please? That's Spurs and their senior leadership and recruitment team planning pre-Postecoglou. And unless Postecoglou says, yikes, I've got massive issue with that, I'm not going to play him, then you obviously pivot. But without saying that, it's a case of business as usual pre-Postecoglou, but you make sure that he's fully part now of any ongoing conversations. I think it's the same for the centre-back. What's going to be more interesting is positions beyond goalkeeper or defence, where Postecoglou, because of his attack-minded style and the fact that, like I said before, he likes width, he likes his midfielders and forwards to go wide, he likes them at points during the game to get chalk on the boots. So does that change any of the targets that Spurs may look at to fit with his style? Because we know, for example, another big Spurs target, in fact, two big Spurs targets, which annoys me because I'm a Leicester fan, for those of you that don't know. 2 big Spurs targets, but one in particular. We spoke about it a year ago, and I think I was the first to report this, and everyone said, really? James Maddison? And now it's obvious that for the best part of a year, Spurs have been tracking James Maddison. So that's one, and that's the kind of known target. And then the other dark horse, I would say, in the conversation for Spurs is Harvey Barnes too. So there may be an opportunity for a double raid. And actually a third player, more vaguely linked as a squad player for Arsenal with nothing too concrete, is Timothy Castagne, who might be the kind of fullback that suits Postecoglou's style. But to be really clear on that, there's been no approach from Tottenham to Castagne. I'm just pointing out another Leicester player who's available in the market that is being looked at by a number of clubs. So this again is where Postecoglou may say, hang on a minute, why have you got this on your list, not that? And this might be because they were basing it on Antonio Conte and his style. And now they know who the new manager is. They need to understand what the style and formation and identity of the football club is going to be. But I think a creative-minded midfielder, whether wide or central, is going to be another target for Tottenham. And there's a very realistic possibility that Tottenham get Maddison. I would say Newcastle are slight favourites at this point because Maddison is intent on playing Champions League football. But on a personal note, Maddison also relishes the chance to move to London. And people often ask me with Maddison why nothing's been done yet, because Leicester have gone down and everyone knew that he was likely to leave, whether Leicester went down or stayed up. And the price will probably be 35 or 40 million pounds. So when you consider Mason Mount is on the market for 70, if we go with Chelsea's valuation, Maddison is a bargain. And based on the first half of the season with Leicester anyway, he was in incredible form. And Harvey Barnes had just a tremendous season all round with Leicester. It's astonishing when you look at those two players' stats and their talent that Leicester went down. But it is what it is. And from a selfish point of view, let's hope we come back up. But with Maddison, just coming back to what I said before, the reason why it's not happened is because Maddison's been on holiday. It's a baby moon. He's about to have twins with his partner. So they need to focus on their personal life. And after the birth, they'll want to understand very quickly, because they'll have 2 newborns, where they're going to be living. And again, footballers are humans. So part of Maddison's decision won't just be about the club. It will be about the city and what's best for his family, because he's not 18 years of age anymore. He's the perfect age. He's at his peak, but he's not 18. He's a father. So he's going to have to think about things in a variety of different ways, not just where's the money and where do I want to go. It's also where do I want to live, what's best for my family. And London has always been at the back of his mind. So Spurs stand a very realistic chance for Maddison. But I think that Newcastle are really pushing, and it wouldn't remotely surprise me if Spurs have to react to Newcastle, in the sense that I think Newcastle will blink first and make the first bid on Maddison. I think Harvey Barnes to Spurs is going to grow legs, though, over the coming weeks. And then we can delve into centre-backs and goalkeepers as well. But obviously on the goalkeeper front, David Raya, everybody knows it's progressing now. The personal terms are not a problem. It's just about the fee. And Thomas Frank had said very openly that 40 million is the number. But the industry, not just Spurs, the wider industry of suitors that are looking, even a club like Chelsea, who haven't necessarily made a move, but they've explored the deal historically, everyone thinks 40 million is too high. So let's wait and see how bullish Brentford are and whether Spurs can get something a little bit cheaper, because if they agree a fee, Raya will join Spurs because he's perfectly happy with the personal terms.
Ben, I have to say, it's always fascinating having you on, because we end up exploring so many different avenues and players that you just bring it into the conversation for us. I have to say, we've got over 1,000 plus of you watching us live. So again, thank you so much for all of your incredible support for Last Word on Spurs. We're joined by the brilliant Jamie Brown over at Daily Hotspur, and tonight's special guest opening up the transfer window for us here on Last Word on Spurs. We're joined by the brilliant broadcaster, journalist, the wonderful Ben Jacobs via CBS Golazo Sports, I must say. Always a pleasure having Ben on. We're going to dive into some individual players, and if Ben is so kind at the end, we might have a little bit of a play around up where you guys in the comments can try and throw us some names, and Ben can by all means let you know those that we can keep an eye on, those that we can dismiss. Right, back to business. Ben, you touched upon Spurs' search for a goalkeeper, and David Raya, obviously the keeper at the moment with personal terms all but there, but just the fee needing to be sorted out. Whenever we heard that from Tottenham before, trying to get a fee sorted out. That obviously means it looks like it's bringing towards an end Hugo Lloris's time at the football club, in which he personally said for him, it is the end of an era. He has desires for other things. Do you expect, on the basis that Spurs are bringing a goalkeeper in, that he will be granted to leave the club this summer? And if so, at the moment, I know many things can change. Where do you think Lloris's likely destination may be?
It's an interesting one with Lloris, but the first thing to say is an incredible servant for the football club, and he was signed at a bargain fee too. So when you look at it that way, Tottenham are not going to make things difficult for Lloris. They're going to allow for an exit on his terms, which means that he's got all of the control here. And there's plenty of offers, to be perfectly honest with you. So he's not going to be spoilt for opportunities. But I think there is an acceptance between Spurs on the football side, and I don't think that this will change under Ange Postecoglou, and Lloris, that if he stays at the football club, he's going to be the number 2. And from Lloris's point of view, it's time, therefore, for a new challenge. One thing I would say is that we're going to see a drive from Saudi Arabia to try and bring him there. My understanding is that that's not of huge appeal. Money can talk and things can change, but I am told that the approach was not necessarily something that blew him away. And it's very difficult with these Saudi Arabia offers, because for those that are unaware, it's all done by the owners of Newcastle United, PIF, to begin with. They are the main deal maker, and they represent 4 clubs in particular in Saudi Arabia. So the club where you're allocated sometimes comes last. So they meet the player, they offer something, and then suddenly the club executives swoop in for a photo, but they haven't really had much to do with the talks, which is ridiculous. Because imagine if Lloris was on the market and the Premier League said, should we send him to Wolves or Villa? It would be ridiculous, but that's effectively what happens. The Saudi Pro League and Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund are determining who goes where with player buy-in, because they're the ones that are ultimately funding the deal. So there is interest in Lloris from Saudi Arabia, and it may be one to watch, but sources continually say that he doesn't necessarily fancy that. I think one of the most interesting things to look at, and it's early stages, so I certainly wouldn't want to over-exaggerate this, and this is why context is key, because the transfer window is fluid. But I think that there is a very real possibility that Nice will try and bring back Hugo Lloris. And I've no indication yet whether he'd be open to the move. But the reason I say that is because Nice signed the ex-Leicester goalkeeper Kasper Schmeichel, and it hasn't really worked out. And he was brought in as a number 1, and there's a real feeling within Nice, even though if you ask Schmeichel, he wants to keep playing. And also he feels that he could be a goalkeeper internationally until he's 40. But from the Nice point of view, it's a slightly different perspective. So they might be in the market for a number 1. And therefore, if you're looking for sentimental returns, why not Lloris back to Nice, where he started his career at, effectively? I know that he was at Sedac, I think in the early 90s, but he was a youth player at Nice. Of course, he came through their second team. And then up until, I would say, about 2008, he was there before he moved to Lyon, the club where he's more traditionally associated with before joining Spurs. So maybe there's a Nice return in all of this. They're definitely one to watch, because they could well be looking for a number 1 goalkeeper.
On the subject of players that were potentially leaving the club, one that has seemed to cool in these recent couple of days, weeks, is Tottenham Hotspur's vice-captain Harry Kane. It looks like it's becoming more and more unlikely by the day that Harry Kane will depart this summer, despite reported interest from both Real Madrid and Manchester United, and especially on the news that Real Madrid might be keen on trying to bring Kylian Mbappe to the football club. We'd just love to know from your personal opinion, Ben, the chances of keeping Harry Kane, maybe not even just this summer, but maybe beyond that, and whether you think Daniel Levy would even consider selling Harry Kane, given his reputation in some Spurs fans' eyes is at an all-time low at the moment.
It's a win, isn't it, for everybody, and especially Daniel Levy if Harry Kane stays. And the only complication is if Kane somehow forces a move and there becomes acrimony, which is the last thing that anybody will want. So this is the balance, really. From Tottenham's point of view, they're calm about the situation. And the last time we spoke, I said that Tottenham felt optimistic Kane would sign a new deal. Now, because of circumstance that was unexpected, I would say they're less optimistic at this point. He'll sign a new deal, not impossible, but the feeling is that even if he doesn't put pen to paper, what Tottenham can do, because Kane is in love with Spurs, is keep him at the football club and try and then get him to fall in love with the Postecoglou project. And if Tottenham's project moves in the right direction, Kane will extend. And one of the big things about Spurs is not just the love for the football club and the desire to win trophies there, but also staying in the Premier League and breaking Alan Shearer's goal scoring record of 260 goals. And of course, he can do that at Manchester United. He can do that anywhere within the Premier League, but he wants to do it at Spurs. He's seen himself as Mr. Spurs, and Spurs see him as Mr. Spurs too. So Kane has a decision to make, because ultimately, if it gets to the point where he thinks the project is moving backwards, then at his age, there will be one final big move that allows him to win trophies. And this was the logic a few seasons back in 2021 in the summer, when before, of course, Erling Haaland arrived and Julian Alvarez as well, he nearly joined Manchester City. But that negotiation tells you what Daniel Levy does. Because when Manchester City came calling, Daniel Levy said, put down a formal offer of £200 million or go away. And Manchester City went away. And obviously now in hindsight, there's a bit of rewriting, because Kane will argue he didn't try and force the move. I know there's some Spurs fans that feel at the time he maybe was pushing for that move in quite an aggressive way. But I think that the likelihood is that Kane will stay at Spurs, and whether he signs or not, will be perfectly content to do that. And in then a calculated decision by Daniel Levy to use Kane next season, try and get him to renew. And then if he does end up leaving, you've got another season out of him and you've got those goals, and hopefully that leads to Champions League football. And again, if the project moves in the right direction, if Kane's scoring goals, Spurs are probably winning games. Let's hope anyway. That's the big surprise about last season. Look at Kane's tally, 30 goals. In any normal Spurs season, where they weren't a defensive shambles, giving teams 2-goal head starts every other week, to the point where Kane had to score a hat-trick to win a game, you would have said at the beginning of the season, if Kane was on 30 goals, Spurs are nailed on for top 4. But they were so defensively weak that Kane needed to score 50 goals like Erling Haaland to get Spurs into the Champions League. And this is the problem. So if Kane does what he does again next season, and Spurs keep a few more clean sheets, they will improve massively and be there or thereabouts as far as Champions League football is concerned. And this is what Levy's thinking. He's got the asset and the weapon. If he loses Kane, who's he going to replace him with? Even if he gets 100+ million. Victor Osimhen's 150 million. Spurs don't have any European football. Dusan Vlahovic would not be guaranteed. And I don't think he'd take to the Premier League on day one and score anywhere close to 30 goals. There's not many Kanes out there. So Levy realises that. And it might be worth taking the risk of losing him on a free. So what I can tell you is that Daniel Levy is going to be stubborn here. And the only way Kane will leave Spurs is if Kane persistently and aggressively forces the move. And that is the situation. And Manchester United know that, which is why there's low optimism. One of the reasons why Manchester United explored this deal so early on the player side was to work out whether there was buy-in, because they don't want their time wasted, because they negotiated with Daniel Levy for Dimitar Berbatov, and it was a nightmare. Even though they got the player, it was a nightmare for Manchester United. So they don't want a repeat scenario of that, which is why Manchester United have gone early to see if it's possible or not. And if it isn't, which is looking likely for them, they'll walk away. And the only caveat I would add is we do need to look at Real Madrid as just a slight anomaly in all of this, because when it was Bayern, those links were never serious. I told you that a year ago, that Kane would not go to Bayern. Kane will still not go to Bayern. Bayern will not bid for Kane. So that's a red herring. But now there's an option at Real, which is glamorous, lucrative. There's maybe some prestige for Kane. There's Bellingham there, who he knows. And it just might complicate the situation, because not every day Real Madrid come calling. And then from Levy's point of view, he's not selling to a Premier League rival. So that can't entirely be discounted. But obviously, Real may focus on Mbappe. I still think that they'll probably wait and get him on a free transfer. But if you sign Kane, then it's actually not a bad thing for Mbappe, because Mbappe wants to play on the wide left. But then what about Vinny Jr.? So there's a lot of complications on the front line even if Real sign Mbappe now, does he play central and does that rule out a move for Kane? Or is he competing with Vinny Jr.? Or does Vinny Jr. actually leave Real Madrid, which is not the expected scenario? There's all kinds of questions around Real Madrid. So Levy won't do anything unless Kane forces him to do anything, is my view on the situation, which is why, because of Kane's respect for Spurs and because of what happened when he nearly, in inverted commas, joined Manchester City a couple of years back, I don't think Kane's really going to throw his toys out the pram. I think that Kane's going to use the opportunity to have as much input as possible. Because when you have change at a football club, you can use the change to have your say. So I think Kane will have been vocal on Postecoglou. I think he'll be vocal on the sporting director. I think he'll be vocal on the style of play. I think he'll be vocal on the summer transfers. And I think if Levy has his way, he'll stay for the season. And then we have to wait and see whether that leads to a renewal or whether actually Kane ends up leaving Spurs on a free, and Levy's quite prepared to take that risk. So it's really going to take a push in terms of fee and in terms of Kane. And even then, I think that it's going to be very difficult for a Premier League club in particular to get Harry Kane.
Now, obviously, in terms of incomings, we spoke at the start of the show about central defence being a really important issue for Spurs to kind of go and strengthen. A list of names have obviously been linked already with the club. We've had Harry Maguire, obviously a big name that has been linked with from Manchester United, Piero Hincapié, Max Kilman. We've obviously got Mark Gay as well. Then there's obviously been the long-term interest in the likes of Josko Gvardiol and Pau Torres. In terms of maybe names on that list and maybe other names that you might know of, are there any guys that we should be keeping an eye on? And do we know of any targets?
I think that from Postecoglou's point of view, he'll input, but my understanding is that he's asking for proven Premier League quality. So you suddenly have a scenario where someone like Gay might bump up the list, and Max Kilman has been a long-term Spurs target. It'll be interesting to see whether or not they still fancy him now. This was a story I actually gave you a year ago, and it's gathering a little bit of legs heading into this window. But what I would say is that when we spoke about a year ago, I think it was August of the last window, Kilman had come off the back of a phenomenal season. And because he grew up playing futsal, he's a ball-playing defender. He's very good in tight spaces. But this season, I don't think Kilman's been as good. So let's see whether or not that puts off Spurs. But it's one possibility. And I think that Gay could be an interesting one. It would be very intriguing to see what the fee is. My understanding from Palace's point of view, even though they themselves need to sort out the managerial situation, is that they're going to be quite stubborn on this. So 55, 60, 65 million, something like that, which seems quite high. But look out for some Premier League defenders. I would add another name, even though I don't think he's going to be gettable, and that's Levi Colwell. And Tottenham are one of the clubs in for Colwell. And just so I don't get misquoted on this, I mean they've discussed him internally. They've got a high appreciation for the player. I don't mean they've moved. And the reason why they've not moved is because, much like Brighton, they're getting the same indications out of Chelsea, which is the player is simply not for sale. And I think that Tottenham are a bit of a disadvantage for Colwell because he's loved it at Brighton. They've got European football and Tottenham don't. If Tottenham had Champions League football, it might have been a different story. But there's a lot of clubs looking at Levi Colwell. And the reason for that is simple, because he's going to become an elite level defender. But I don't think Tottenham will move on that. But certainly discussed in the back end of Paratici's tenure, only to, of course, find now that there'll be a new sporting director coming in. And then we know that Tottenham in the past have looked at Bastone, but Inter are adamant that he's not for sale. And I think they're right in that, in terms of if Inter can keep two players over this summer, it will be Bastone, because Milan Skriniar, another ex-Spurs target, has gone to PSG. So I think that Bastone, Inter see as untouchable, and the same maybe for Lautaro Martinez. But the reason why I mention any Inter player really is because there's a feeling within the industry, agents, clubs looking to buy, insiders, the Inter will have to sell. So they can shout and scream until they're blue in the face, or blue and black in the face, because it's Inter, that they're not selling anybody, but they do not have a healthy financial situation. And there they are chasing after players that they really want to sign, like Romelu Lukaku, who's been on loan this season. Something's got to give. And Inter made a big mistake, actually, with Skriniar not selling to PSG when there was about 60 million euros on the table last summer, because that would have helped. And PSG said, we're not going any higher. And Inter said, fine. And then PSG waited, and now they've got Skriniar incoming on a free transfer. And it means that Inter are 60, 65 million euros out of pocket. So they're going to have to sell. And then, of course, the other name that will divide opinion is Harry Maguire. And my understanding on Harry Maguire is that Tottenham have discussed the player and feel like if they got the Harry Maguire that plays for England, he could be a very effective signing. And this maybe is indication of just how much influence in the absence of a sporting director does Harry Kane have, because Kane's a big fan of Maguire. They're really good friends. They have a decent understanding on and off the field. And I know when people say decent understanding on and off the field, well, one's a forward, one's a centre-back. What understanding can they have? Well, when you do set pieces or just when you're playing in training and you're doing different things, it's natural to have a relationship with a player that you wouldn't normally directly connect with unless they're both forwards in the box for something. And they get each other. And the reason why they get each other is because Kane feels like Maguire at his best, and I know at his worst, he's error prone, but at his best can be that kind of ball playing defender that can move the ball forwards quickly and positively, which means that if Maguire's phase 1 and Kane doesn't receive the ball until phase 3 or phase 4, 2, 3, 4 touches down the line, Maguire still might be the one, even though it gets unnoticed, that set it off. And I remember at my club when we had Danny Drinkwater and N'Golo Kante at Leicester, they were really good in the centre of the midfield at doing that. The amount of times that they just played something positive, even if it looked like quite a simple pass. And then when you look back at the goal, you're like, wow, they were integral because they've got that speed of delivery and they've got that speed of thinking. And I think that Kane genuinely thinks that's the case with Maguire, even at 30, and even though he gets caricatured so often. So it's not a signing that would go down well with the Spurs fan base. But if Maguire can get back to, I would say, his Leicester best and his England best, because he's a leader as well, he could be quite valuable. But I want to make one thing clear on Harry Maguire, because every single window we get a free-for-all about Maguire's going here, Maguire's going there. Maguire has been discussed as an option, and maybe Kane is somebody that would be Team Maguire, but Spurs haven't done anything yet. So there's no indication that Tottenham will go to Manchester United at this point. I'm not aware of any approach. I'm not aware of any direct talk between Tottenham and the Maguire camp or Manchester United and Tottenham at this point. So if anything happens, it's incredibly early stages and it's internal, but definitely one of the names that has at least been discussed within what I want to call Tottenham's recruitment team, but you almost can't call it the recruitment team because Scott Munn is relatively new. Ange Postecoglou is only just through the door and there is no sporting director. So it's normal that when that chemistry builds, particularly between the new sporting director and Postecoglou and Munn, that they might have some different targets, because obviously at the moment that leadership team around recruitment isn't really functional yet. So it's normal that Spurs might have to pivot.
Always, man. I keep saying it's always fascinating stuff. In terms of where we are defensive on our situation, now you'd think if the club are going to look to invest, as Jamie mentioned there, in a couple of centre-backs and try and strengthen that back line for Ange Postecoglou, then you'd at least feel the club are going to have to move on some of those defenders in what is going to be, my understanding, a 37-man bloated squad when you consider everybody that's going to come back from loan. So we have seen actually reported interest from Besiktas in Ivan Perisic, while it was reported recently that Ryan Sessegnon, Davinson Sanchez's future are in doubt, as well as the club potentially listening to bids for Eric Dyer, Ben Davis, Sergio Reguilon. What do you think on that, Ben? I mean, would it be realistic to think you can actually see up to 6 or 7 players leaving this window?
I think so, and that's because the squad size is bloated, as you say. So Ange Postecoglou needs a manageable squad size. We saw this at Chelsea. If the squad size is too swollen, then it's a recipe for disaster. And I think in looking at who might leave, we have to consider who's a fit, particularly, again, in defence. So when I look at Eric Dyer, I would say keep. But is he a fit with how Postecoglou wants to play? And that's ultimately a determination for the new manager. So there could be suddenly a possibility that somebody that we thought a month ago would stay will end up leaving. I think that Tottenham are going to have to get rid of at least 5 and maybe 7. So this is where 1 or 2 names that we weren't thinking would leave suddenly might come into play. And the thing with Dyer is that he had been in those talks about a contract extension. At the moment, nothing's been signed, but he is only 29. And I think that everyone says his form dipped during the season, but he was battling injury. So now we have to understand where he is going to go. And I do think that there's a possibility that he might leave the football club. I think that Ivan Perisic is an interesting one, and there's plenty of interest. And it is fair to say that his future is in some doubt. And part of that, again, is because of a point I made earlier, that he was very much an Antonio Conte signing. And I think the other thing about Perisic is that he looked inspired in the early part of the season, in my opinion, but didn't finish the season strong. And then when you think again about Postecoglou and a 4-3-3 that we expect him to play, it feels pretty unlikely that Perisic will be left back in that system in a 4-man defence. And Destiny Udogie, remember, is arriving, and we think he's competing with Sessegnon, but Sessegnon could be somebody that becomes available on the market as well. So I see actually not just a big squad, but in that particular area, far too many names, which means that Perisic, for me, will end up being a casualty. And as you say, there's some interest from Turkey. There's some interest again from Saudi Arabia, Al Hilal in particular, the club that are considering him. And seemingly there is a possibility of going to Inter again. But how are they going to afford? And it's not just about, can you get a player at a bargain? It's wages, it's agent fees. So a lot is up in the air at the moment. But what I would say is that Perisic fit Conte. And we know also, by the way, that he won Serie A under Conte at Inter as well. And I think the Coppa Italia too. So not necessarily a fit within the Postecoglou system, and had a better first half of the season, in my opinion anyway, than second half of the season. So I think that he's probably one of the more likely outgoings.
So some other names that have obviously been linked with potentially a move away. Pierre-Emile Højbjerg is another name who, as I said, today was linked with maybe leaving the club. Harry Winks as well, another name that obviously he's been out on loan, could go. Giovanni Lo Celso, another midfielder. So what kind of the possibilities and chances of those 3 going?
I don't think that anything has been decided yet on Højbjerg, if I'm honest. Some are terming him as having an uncertain future. I'm not so sure at this point, because one thing that you always have to consider is Postecoglou hasn't really met any of these players yet. So there'll be some outgoings that he doesn't just want to commit to. He wants to see them during pre-season. And I think that Højbjerg, from what I'm told anyway from sources, is actually still waiting to find out whether he has a future at the football club. So part of that will be about him trying to impress his new manager, or determining whether before Postecoglou something was pre-decided there. But he really hasn't been told anything. And at the moment, he's away on national team duty ahead of the Euro qualifying matches. And there is also still, I think, 2 years, correct me if I'm wrong in the chat, remaining on his deal at Spurs. So there's not even necessarily an urgency from Tottenham's point of view to sort it today or tomorrow. But what I again would say is Postecoglou's primary decision will be who works the way he wants to play. And with Højbjerg, we know that he's defensive-minded, he's tenacious, and he's not always on the front foot. So again, very much a fit for Conte's system, not necessarily for Postecoglou. And when we were talking about Postecoglou before, I was explaining that it's not that this 4-3-3 is so innovative that a Tottenham player can't adapt to it. It's just such a big step from the Conte ball to the Postecoglou ball, minus 2 interims. And that, I think, will provide a complication and make pre-season one of transition from Tottenham's point of view. Postecoglou is going to, like Pochettino at Chelsea, make sure that his squad bond, make sure that they're not just fit, but they're exhausted during pre-season, and then they'll rest and hopefully have the stamina to have a very successful season. So Postecoglou very much wants players that accelerate over short spaces, that play direct and quick passes, that have got speed of thought, and also can get box to box. And I think that Højbjerg is combative, but not necessarily competent in all of those areas that I've outlined. So that might be one to watch as well. And I just think that you've mentioned a few players that were returning to Tottenham. And again, very likely that there'll be ones that Tottenham look for a solution for, whether it's another loan or whether they try and sell them. Harry Winks is a really interesting one in particular, because he always just seems to be this uncertain player. I'm sure we spoke about Harry Winks a year ago, and it was exactly the same thing. And there's no stability there. And he's 27 years of age now, and he's been out on loan at Sampdoria, and they've got financial problems. So we should point out Sampdoria were very keen on keeping Winks, but they can't because they've got financial problems. And it actually looks like there's going to be a takeover from the Leeds owner, and QSI, who held talks with Spurs, are part of that consortium. So once they get in, and it's likely that they will, things might change, but there's nothing imminent there. And there was also no obligation to buy on the loan deal of Harry Winks either. So even if Winks wanted the option, Sampdoria were always able to back out of that, and now they simply can't afford him. And interestingly, with Winks, there was some interest from Premier League clubs, but guess what? They're both down now. It was Leicester and it was Southampton, who had both at least explored the possibility of a deal towards the end of January with a view to the summer. But I don't see Winks wanting to go and play Championship football for either of those clubs. And then there is some interest from Lorient as well, which is the club that the Bournemouth owner, Bill Foley, also has a 33% stake in. So I actually think that Winks will find a solution, but it won't be Sampdoria, and I don't think it'll be Spurs either.
Now, one player that I think yourself has kind of linked us with, I think you mentioned it on the United stand, and that was Jadon Sancho. You said there was genuine interest in him. Now, obviously, he's had a difficult 2 years at Manchester United, arrived as this big star, obviously, for big money. It's not quite worked out for him. Is this someone that Spurs could genuinely move for? And if Spurs were to go for him, what kind of fee would we be looking at for Jadon Sancho?
Yeah, this is a story I broke now about 5 days ago, and I think that it's gathering a little bit of pace. I know that some people will say it's all just agent talk, but I think it's more than that. I think that Tottenham are looking at the possibility of Sancho because they see a real opportunity due to the player's age and profile. But there's complications. One is fee and two is wages. And Manchester United, as I understand it, don't have Sancho at the top of their list to sell. So what will happen first is a conversation between Sancho and Erik ten Hag to understand the pathway for the player at Manchester United and the expectations for him heading into next season. And if Sancho moves to Tottenham, he may feel that he can get more game time, and we wait and see whether that is a defining factor or not. So I don't know whether Spurs fans will be excited about this or not, because the Manchester United numbers are nowhere near as impressive as the ones at Borussia Dortmund. I think it was only 6 Premier League goals last season in just under 30 appearances, and that was off the back of a season where he only scored 3. But if he turns back into the Dortmund player, then there are a couple of seasons there, probably 18-19 and maybe 19-20, where he was in double figures. And there was one season in particular where he pretty much scored a goal every other game and chipped in with a bunch of assists as well. So wages might be a problem, but fee-wise, for the right number, Manchester United would consider a sale. And I think that number is unfortunately going to be quite high. I don't think that Sancho is going to be available in the market for under 50 million. It might even push 60 million. So it's a big outlay. And obviously, even though some of the players we've discussed, like Barnes and Maddison, are all slightly different, and Maddison can go in central areas, I don't think that Spurs are going to drop a cumulative number of 100 million on two wide or creative-minded players or goal scorers or attacking midfielders, whatever the position is. I don't think they're going to drop 100+ million on two. So if they go for Maddison, I don't see them going for Sancho as well, even though, as I say, we're talking about slightly different kinds of players here. And therefore, we can refer to Sancho as a target, and we can certainly say that the interest in him is real. But let's see how it progresses, because there are complications over both the fee and also the wages.
Ben, thank you as always. You very kindly gave us a conclusive update earlier on where things are with James Maddison and his status at the moment in relation to also what's happening in his personal life. There has been some murmurs of some alternative targets for Tottenham in that area. One of those today that were mentioned was Conor Gallagher. And another player that I've seen mentioned by no real, I'd say, how can I put this, high-profile sources at the moment, is that of Eze of Crystal Palace. I'd love to ask you whether you feel either of those players might become of interest to Spurs as this window does tend to progress.
Nothing really on Eze to Spurs to add. If that changes, I'll let you know. I think it would be really special for Eze if he can make his England debut, which is to be expected, and that's well earned. And that's his focus. And then we'll wait and see whether anyone comes in. Of course, there's going to be interest, but I'm not aware of anything at Tottenham's end at this point. With Conor Gallagher, I think it's a bit more interesting because Chelsea will sell Conor Gallagher at the right number. And it might drag on a bit because let's not forget they lost Jorginho to Arsenal in January, and N'Golo Kante is about to join Al Ittihad. Mateo Kovacic could be out the door and joining Manchester City. He's agreed personal terms. It's just about whether the clubs can determine a fee. So that's 3 senior midfielders. And then if Gallagher was just sold, they perversely need to reduce their squad size, but they wouldn't have enough in central midfield. And as a consequence, I think that Chelsea will look to bring in somebody before they consider anything for Conor Gallagher. And he's a strange one because it will simply depend upon Postecoglou. And we saw with Lampard, he was a big fan of Conor Gallagher, and Gallagher actually finished the season quite strongly. We've never really seen the Conor Gallagher consistently at Chelsea that we saw when he was on loan at Crystal Palace in the first half of that season, where he was scoring goals for fun and he looked like an absolute world beater. So the potential is there, but maybe Chelsea isn't the right club for him. So we're looking at Gallagher being possible for 40 to 45 million, I would say. The clubs that have looked at Gallagher in the past, Crystal Palace have wanted him back, and Newcastle United and Everton have looked. Gallagher was not keen on the Everton move. Newcastle never made an offer, but have inquired about the player in the past. And Crystal Palace have been clear that they wanted him back, and Chelsea chose to keep on to him. So because Chelsea do need a bit of money and to offload some players, if we watch Chelsea bring in a midfielder or two, then they might be tempted by an offer for Conor Gallagher. So it's one to watch.
Just 2 other names that Spurs were kind of, or Spurs fans certainly wanted to ask about, was Alex Scott of Bristol City. Now, a lot of Spurs fans are kind of shown on Twitter that he is actually a big Spurs fan, or he was a Spurs fan. I don't know how strong his support is at the moment, but yeah, obviously Alex Scott being one of them. Now, another player that has been linked with Spurs is Rio Hatate, obviously of Celtic, a guy who did very well under Postecoglou, was a big central midfielder for his team. Is there anything that you've heard on those two in particular, Alex Scott? Because I know a lot of Spurs fans want to know about him.
Alex Scott was a story that I broke about a year ago. And then in January, I revealed that he would definitely go this summer. And that is still my understanding, that Bristol City will not be able to hang on to the player. And they know that. So there's, believe it or not, 8 different clubs that in the last year have inquired about Alex Scott. And Tottenham are one of them. So there is a very realistic possibility that they move on a fantastic player who I think could in the future be very big and consistent in the Premier League. Now, the fee being asked for is around about 30 to 35 million. I know in some places you'll see 25 million. Bristol City want more than that, albeit it might be an all-in number. But this isn't a 10, 12, 15 million deal with a few add-ons. This is a 25, 30, 35 million pound deal. And that tells you what a big talent the player is. So I would expect Tottenham to be in the race here. I also think that Wolves are one to watch. The good news from Tottenham's point of view is that Leeds United and Leicester were big on Scott. And again, they've dropped down. So it makes it a lot harder for them to now do business. There's no real reason for Scott to leave Bristol City at 19 years of age, where he's playing regularly, and just join another championship club. And what you get from Scott is high intelligence, positive passing. He's fit, he's fast, he's strong, he's mature for his age. Didn't really chip in with too many goals last season. I think it was only one in the championship. But if you look at the season before, he scored 4 times in the championship, and he was only 18 years of age then. So I think that box to box and that ability to be right place, right time, and to burst forwards when it's asked of him, even though it's not innate in his game, could be an area of development. But very solid, big future ahead of him in the game. And absolutely, if we're talking about Paratici, 100% on Tottenham's radar. They were one of the clubs. Wolves are going to push very hard as well. I think that we can also be taking a look to an extent anyway at some clubs with European football. Brighton might be one to watch. I was going to say Villa, but their interest has cooled, and they've obviously also signed Yuri Tielemans on a free transfer from Leicester now, and I don't think they'll strengthen in another way in the centre of the park at this stage. So there's a lot of interest, and as I say, there is a very decent chance that Spurs escalate that interest by approaching Bristol City between now and when the window shuts. And like you say, people have noticed that Scott likes Spurs and also likes London. So beyond the fact that there's no European football, there is a lot to like about a potential Tottenham move. So now we have to wait and see what happens. I'm hesitant to say they'll definitely move because Paratici is not there. If Paratici was still at the football club and we were talking in January, I would have told you categorically that Tottenham will be there this summer.
As we do approach the closure of this show, we've got a couple more questions to ask Ben. I'm going to invite, if Ben has come to, I want to invite the listeners and the viewers in if they want to share any names that we can put to Ben in a fire round, if that's the most politest way of putting it, where Ben can kind of say a yay or nay as if there's any Spurs interest. So I invite all of that 1,400 of you that are very kindly watching us live right now. If you just want to put some names in that maybe we haven't touched upon this show, it's your chance to get involved. Feel free to bring them into the context, and we'll fire them across to Ben at the end. But I want to hand back over to Jamie. Over to you.
Yeah, now obviously another player that is returning to Spurs this summer is Tanguy Ndombele. We have seen lots of reports suggesting that he'll return to the club, and Ange Postecoglou kind of wants to take a look at him. Is he a player that might potentially have another chance? I was going to say a second chance there, but I think he's already had several chances. Is he a player that could finally come good for Spurs and maybe be given that opportunity under Postecoglou?
You know what? I really hope so. He's still only 26. And as you say, it just hasn't clicked. But now, after a successful season long with Napoli, he's going to be back at Spurs. And there's a real opportunity to impress a new manager and have a fresh slate. So I can't tell you, I'm not a mind reader, whether Postecoglou is going to use him, is going to rate him. But there is an opportunity off the back of a very good season, in my opinion, with Napoli. So I think the jury's out, to be honest. I think that Tottenham fans watching might be a little bit dubious that he'll suddenly come back, hit the ground running and be integral. But we're going to have to wait and see. But it's been a long road back. And I definitely think that the season-long loan with Napoli helped. So there could be a role to play there, but we're going to have to wait and see. And we also have to wait and see as well whether anybody comes in for the player as well. The funny thing about the Napoli loan was that the feeling prior to that was always it would be Juventus. And they had him on the radar, but they never moved. And now they're in such a difficult position in terms of finances, in terms of sanctions, in terms of lack of Champions League football, that I don't see them coming back into the race for the player either. So let's just wait and see at this point. I think it's too early to judge. But what I would say is that the saving grace from Tottenham's point of view is that this is a player they've had since 2019. He's been out on loan to Lyon. He's been out on loan to Napoli. He's obviously only won a handful of caps for the French national team. I don't even think he's been capped for 2 years for the French national team. But this is the first year with Napoli as a Serie A winner where he's actually played consistently. He played 40 plus games. And I think the last time he did that was 2020, 2021 for Spurs. But if you look effectively at the 2021 to 2022 season, and then the Lyon loan as well, he's barely involved. Didn't score, barely assisted, didn't do anything really for Lyon. And I think he only played about 10 games in Ligue 1. And then obviously in the back end of his Spurs performances in 2021, 2022, I can't think of too many games that he played in the Premier League either. It must have been less than 10. So then you go to Napoli and he's won things and he's confident and he's played 30 plus league games and he's played 40 plus in all competitions. So maybe that momentum will give him a real opportunity of hitting the ground running at Spurs. And I hope so, because from what I'm told, he's a fantastic character. He's a hard worker. No one wants it to succeed more than him coming back to Spurs. So it's a long window, but if he brings that Napoli momentum back to Tottenham, there is a chance that Ange Postecoglou will notice and use him.
But I've got to say, it's been a fascinating hour and 15 minutes that has quite frankly flown by. It always does when we get together and do these shows. There was obviously the big report you gave us when you was on this show in January that, I think that did send shockwaves amongst the Spurs fan base. And that was the potential interest with relation to Qatari ownership at Tottenham. Now, there has been reports that interest has cooled in the last few weeks. I'd be interested to know if that's something you're aware of personally. And the status of any overseas or potential takeover of Tottenham Hotspur to your understanding at the moment.
I wouldn't say it's cooled so much as it's been delayed. And that's not to imply that it will definitely happen, because remember when we were speaking about this and I broke the exclusive, the talks were exploratory. But the two reasons why things are delayed are, one, because Qatar, if you like, turned its attention to the Manchester United sale. And even though QSI are not part on paper, at least to my knowledge, of the Sheikh Jassim bid, everything is driven by the Emir. So QSI cannot invest in a minority sense in Spurs and have 9-2 Foundation by Manchester United. So we have to wait for the Manchester United sale process to finally be resolved. And then if Qatar don't have a Premier League club, there is a chance that Tottenham comes back on the table. But the other point, perhaps more significant, is Daniel Levy in all of this. And even though we heard some reports that Joe Lewis might be open to some kind of investment or even a full sale, the feeling, talking to sources that QSI get from the Daniel Levy side, is that there is nothing at this point that is imminent, and the appetite for the type of investment that QSI were offering is not yet there. And that might be because financially they were not happy with some of the ballparks being spoken about, or it might be that ultimately Spurs want to move in a different direction. And the thing about QSI is that QSI are not looking, with the exception maybe of Malaga, where they're kind of going to have to mop it up from another Qatari owner if they purchase all of that club. QSI are not really looking to be that hands-on. They're not looking to buy a big football club like the 9-2 Foundation and Manchester United. They're looking to minority invest, and they're looking to get a return on investment, and they're looking to let the clubs run themselves. And you see that with Braga, and you'll see that with Sampdoria. If QSI wanted Sampdoria, they'd have bought Sampdoria, but they've actually partnered with Ace Ventures, which is the Leeds owner, and they'll only take a small percentage because, again, they don't want to run the football club. They want to invest in the football club. And for whatever reason, it doesn't look like Daniel Levy and Joe Lewis want to go down that route at this point. So it was not a no so much as a put it on the back burner until both the Manchester United situation, but also Spurs situation is clearer, because QSI didn't get an overwhelming sense that this was the kind of deal structurally that necessarily Tottenham would go for. And that's the point of exploratory talks. You try and find out what's possible. So I wouldn't say it's impossible, because QSI are adamant, talking to sources, that they will go big in 2023. And Qatar, more broadly, including QSI, does want a Premier League club, whether that's minority investment or whether that's an outright sale. So it's probably one to pick up again after the Manchester United sale process comes to a conclusion, so we know whether the 9-2 Foundation have succeeded, because if they succeed, it will take Spurs off the table entirely. But if they don't succeed, then Nasser Al-Khelaifi might just go back to his friend Daniel Levy and try and revisit the situation. We can't rule that out, but at this point, I wouldn't get overexcited about it. I think more broadly, it'll be interesting to see whether there is a change in the mentality of Daniel Levy off the back of this backlash. And if everything settles at Spurs, does he have an exit plan? And there's long been a feeling that there's almost been a divide between what Joe Lewis wants and what Daniel Levy wants. And maybe Levy wants to get investment, but continue in his role and have nothing change except money, effectively. I know I'm simplifying it, but that's the Levy perspective. And I don't want to disrespect Levy and say that's exactly what he's thinking. At one point, I'm sure he'll come out and say it himself, but I think everyone's aware that Levy's still attached and invested in the football club. Whereas I think that Joe Lewis might be more open to a full sale over the course of the next however many years at the right number. Because if everybody sees Manchester United go for 5.5 billion, let's just say, everyone's seen Chelsea go for 2.5 billion, Spurs are eventually going to join that investment party in the same way that Liverpool have explored that type of investment. But at the moment, there's just a hesitancy at the Spurs end when I speak to sources, which probably tells you that Daniel Levy isn't ready to go just yet.
Ben, thanks so much for that update. Right, the player roundup. We'll try and do this, Ben, as I can do it as easy as possible, not complicate too many things. So defenders-wise, we've had Ibanez, Laporte is the two mentioned defensively. I don't know if you want to say yay or nay to them first on those two. Anything you want to add on those two?
Don't really know a great deal about Ibanez, to be honest with you, other than the fact that from the perspective of the player, he was quite happy at Roma, but they failed to win their European final. So let's see whether that changes something. I know Spurs have been linked with it. Not too much more to add at this point.
Okay, no problem at all. And then in terms of midfielders, we've had Amrabat once again showing up, Zaniolo, Ward-Prowse, and I think Kyogo as well is on there. Forgive me, I believe he does fall into that category. Anything on those names at the moment, Ben, or is it maybe a bit too early?
Ward-Prowse goes somewhere for sure and would be a fantastic signing as well, I think, for any club. I'm not aware of anything advanced at this point, but Ward-Prowse definitely someone that Spurs discussed internally as early as January. Romeo Lavia, another name as well, by the way, in midfield, more associated with either Arsenal or potentially Chelsea, but Spurs again are well aware of his situation. I don't think Sofiane Amrabat will end up at Spurs though.
Okay.
Zaniolo as well, somebody that we spoke about the last time I came on, has had a torrid time with injury, big fallout with Jose Mourinho. When Spurs played Roma in a friendly around the last time we spoke, they were indeed seriously discussing Zaniolo, but this is again the change in strategy, because that was all about Paratici, that was all about Antonio Conte, that was all about getting Zaniolo to be more versatile, because there was a real feeling with Antonio Conte that this was actually a player that could play deep, that could play wide, that could play central, that could be fullback, that could be midfielder, that could be winger, which might sound quite strange if Roma fans are listening, because he burst onto the scene with huge potential, got injured, and has lacked a bit of quality and consistency since, and obviously fell out with Jose Mourinho as well. So I think that one's off the table now at this point, only because the people invested in that are not ultimately at the football club anymore.
I'm going to let Jay finish the interrogation. Jay, over to you, my friend, to close it.
Yeah, Ben, so it'd be obviously interesting to get your opinion on what might constitute a good season for Spurs, obviously with a new manager in place, no European football to contend with this season. Obviously, a lot of fans might see that as a bad thing. Might potentially allow Spurs, be a good thing for Spurs in terms of getting that first trophy, because obviously allows us maybe more of a focus on the FA Cup, the League Cup as well. So, and then of course, you know, how many signings would it take for Spurs to achieve those targets? So kind of two questions there, but as I said, what do you think will constitute a successful season for Spurs?
Well, I think if Tottenham are not in the top 4, it's not a successful season. I know that sounds harsh because they didn't even have any European football, but how demoralizing, how pessimistic if the yardstick for a strong season is just getting back into any form of European football. Tottenham need to take 2 steps forwards, not 1. That's my opinion. Otherwise, even if they take 1 step forwards, they'll fall behind. And this is the challenge, because Manchester United might have new owners. Chelsea might improve. Liverpool, for me, will improve. Arsenal will still be there. Manchester City will win the league. So it's going to take something truly exceptional for Tottenham to be in the top 4. And part of that will be about hanging on to Harry Kane. So the first thing I would like to judge is Tottenham on game 1. Because if on game 1 they've still got Harry Kane, then I think the aim has to be top 4. If they lose quality and don't move quickly in the market, then expectations will have to be leveled. So the weird thing about Spurs, regardless of who they bring in or not, 3, 4, 5 names are not going to fix all, as much as sort your goalkeeper situation out, get a quality centre-back, stop being a defensive shambles, and allow Harry Kane to score 30 goals. And a lot of those components are actually at the club already. So granted, goalkeeper is important, as I've just said. But even if they only made 2 or 3, it's more about what Postecoglou can do in terms of identity, in terms of clean sheets, and in terms of keeping Harry Kane. Because then Tottenham have got as good a chance as any. I mean, I think if you put Harry Kane into any of last season's top half of the table and parachuted his 50 goals into them, every single one of those teams would have at least 10 more points. And if you give Tottenham 10 more points, they're suddenly not far off. But unfortunately, the 10 points that you expect to be the difference maker with Kane were undone by 20 points or whatever lost, because they threw so many games away, which is so uncharacteristic under Antonio Conte. So my feeling is this: there will not be outrage if Tottenham finish in the top 6, as long as the style of football is entertaining and there's progress. And then if they hang on to Harry Kane, it will be a acceptable season. But this is the problem, that Tottenham is a great club with a phenomenal stadium, an amazing fan base. So why should the fan base be saying, okay, we're not going to give you stick, we're going to allow you to finish 5th or 6th, and say, great, it's better than being outside of European football, bring on the Europa League, and next season we'll be in the top 4. So I think there has to be an understanding that things don't happen overnight. And there has to be an understanding with Chelsea as well, how far the club has fallen. But fundamentally, the aim has to still be top 4. Whether it's ambitious, whether it's feasible, whether it's undermined by other clubs being incredible, who knows? But if I'm Tottenham and I'm starting the season saying we're likely to finish below Arsenal, not good enough. If I'm saying we're likely to finish below Newcastle, not good enough. If I'm saying we're likely to finish below Villa and Brighton, definitely not good enough, especially with 30 goals from Harry Kane. And that can't be forgotten. So I think there's pressure on Ange Postecoglou, because this is not about a rebuild with low expectations. This is about Tottenham returning to the top 4, which is the ultimate aim of the project. And whether they sneak into 4th or whether they end up doing what Arsenal did and challenging much higher and then falling down at the last minute, anything outside of 4th, for me, maybe Spurs fans disagree, it's underwhelming. Do I think Spurs will finish in the top 4? No. Should the aim be to finish in the top 4? Yes. And I hope they do, because it's a great club and they deserve success, because it's a long-suffering fan base that pay hard-earned money and high prices to back their club week in, week out. And they deserve an attacking brand of football, a successful brand of football, and to finally stabilise as one of the top clubs in England.
Ben, it always is a fascinating time whenever we get together to do these shows. I'm only gutted that it only happens during the transfer window. You're probably relieved, given how much pressure you're under during these shows. But I've got to say, it's been a fascinating hour and a half. There's been over 3,000 of you plus that have tuned in across all of our platforms to listen and watch this Last Word on Spurs. We've been joined by the wonderful Jamie Brown over at the Daily Hotspur. And we've also been joined by the superb, brilliant, whenever he comes here, we want more of him. We've been joined by the brilliant broadcaster, journalist Ben Jacobs. Ben, for anyone who doesn't know who you are, and I'm not sure how they can't know who you are, especially since you've been coming on Last Word on Spurs here on these transfer windows, where can everybody follow you during, I'm sure, what's meant to be and going to be another epic transfer window to come?
Yeah, I think it will be epic. You can follow me at Jacobs Ben on Twitter. If you're over in America, you can find me on CBS. You can go to the CBS website, see some of the written stuff. And obviously, I will be around on shows like this throughout the window as well. So I'm really excited for the window to open and always willing to engage. I mean, I think I would just say there's lots of top Spurs journalists out there. I really respect Alistair Gold, Matt Law as well, two that focus predominantly on Spurs, or it's one of their big clubs anyway. And I think that during the window, you just have to understand it's not your journalists that are unreliable, it's the window itself. So we do our best to keep you across all of the stories. But of course, things change. I'll come off this call and an agent will have messaged me, a player will have messaged me, a club will have messaged me, and I'll be like, oh, okay, tonight something happened that I didn't know about because I was on Last Word on Spurs. So you have two options. I think I said this last time, but I want to finish by saying it again. Number one, you ride the roller coaster and you pull your hair out and you follow every twist and turn and you love it because you understand how the window works. And it's like watching a movie. It's got plot twists. And then eventually there's a conclusion. It might be positive, it might be negative. Number two, if you're frustrated with the way that the media report and the window works, put on one notification, Tottenham Hotspur Football Club. Go to bed, ignore Ben Jacobs. Always good advice, by the way, even outside of the transfer window. Ignore Ben Jacobs. And then when the notification buzzes, you will know the factual reality of who your club has and hasn't signed. And you'll never know that they tried for X, Y, or Z. So it's up to you which way you want to consume the window. But just bear in mind that it's not linear. It's never black and white.
Honestly, Ben, it's always fascinating stuff. Thank you ever so much. Really, really appreciate it. For those asking, we might try and grab Ben if we can before the end of the summer window. If he might have us, I'm sure the man's going to be very, very busy with what he's got to come. I want to say a massive, massive thank you to wonderful Jamie Brown over at Daily Hotspur. Jay, fascinating show, bud. Just getting started, aren't we? Riding that roller coaster again, as Ben says.
Yeah, I mean, first day of the window, and obviously we've had some fantastic guests on already, and Ben was obviously fantastic to listen to, some amazing insight, and hopefully some of the news that we've heard today comes true because some lots of exciting players there. So yeah, really good show.
Oh, thank you so much. I said, as Ben's encyclopedic nature, what a standard to set for the rest of what we've got to come this window. It's going to be a very, very hard bar to match. The wonderful Ben Jacobs. Ben, I want to say again a massive, massive thank you for your time. Real pleasure. And we'll see what we can do towards the end of the window. We'd love to bring you back if, of course, you can make time for Last Word on Spurs. I'm going to be very, very busy.
Look forward to it. Always happy to come on. Keep up the good work. Always enjoy listening to the show. Oh,
you're a top man. Thank you so much. Well, from Jamie, from Ben, from me, guys who've been the Last Word on Spurs. We'll be back before you know it. As always, keep safe, keep well. Happy summer transfer window. And as always, come on, you Spurs.